Welcome to Culture and History. Every culture has a story, and every story shapes our culture. I'm your host, K&H, and this space is about truth, reflection, and rediscovery. Here we dive deep beneath the surface of what we've been told, exploring the stories that formed humanity's consciousness from ancient to the modern world. So let's open the scroll and begin this journey.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really going under the surface, taking a hard look at the foundations of modern South Korean identity. South Korea often gets presented as this shining example of modernization, right? A tech giant, a cultural exporter with K-pop and movies taking over the world. A real economic miracle story. But the sources we've dug into for this deep dive paint a much more complicated picture. They suggest that this modern success story rests on something quite paradoxical, maybe even uncomfortable. We're talking about a foundation built not just on Korean values, but significantly shaped by a borrowed, exclusionary Western racial ideology. So our mission today is to unpack how Western eugenics, and even the idea of whiteness itself, became intertwined with notions of national strength and purity in South Korea, especially under leaders like Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee.
Yeah, it's a really crucial topic and honestly a difficult one, because the sources compel us to confront this idea that modern Korean identity was, in a fundamental way, sculpted by Western ideology. And the core paradox we need to unpack is this. During that crucial nation-building period, the path to what was seen as civilization, as progress, even as full humanity, got explicitly linked to the attributes associated with whiteness.
So whiteness is the standard.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
We're going to look at how the Korean concept of sunhaeol, that's pure blood, how it shifted from being about shared heritage to becoming, as one source puts it, a moral cornerstone of the modern state. And this shift was really fueled by Western racial science. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? A nation striving for liberation, trying to define itself after colonialism, but ultimately doing so using the moral and racial categories of the very powers it aimed to prove itself equal to.
Okay, let's trace that journey. It seems like the starting point has to be the intellectual inheritance. To understand why sunhaeol became so central, we need to look at Syngman Rhee, the first president. Rhee was educated in the U.S., Harvard, Princeton back in the early 1900s. Why is that specific time and place so critical here?
It's absolutely vital because the intellectual environment Rhee stepped into wasn't just about democracy or liberal arts. The early 20th century American Academy, places like Princeton, where he studied under Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson himself, yeah.
Exactly. These places were saturated, absolutely saturated, with eugenic thinking and ideas about civilizational hierarchies. This wasn't seen as fringe stuff. It was mainstream science, history, anthropology back then. So Rhee absorbed this worldview that systematically ranked races, with Caucasians firmly at the top. And this wasn't just presented as opinion. It was framed as objective fact, as, social Darwinism in action.
So when he looked at Korea's situation, colonized and struggling,
he didn't reject the hierarchy itself. That's the key point. He seemed to have concluded that the hierarchy was real, but that Korea's problem was its position on that hierarchy. It was too low down the ladder.
Wow. That's a profound twist. He internalized the framework of white supremacy, but his goal wasn't to dismantle it, but to somehow use it.
That's what the sources suggest. It's described as this tragic paradox of early Korean nationalism, anti-colonial in its aims, sure, but deeply colonial in its psychology. Rhee wasn't trying to tear down the global racial ranking system.
He's trying to climb it.
Exactly. He was trying to engineer Korea's ascent. The path to independence and dignity, in this view, involved mimicking the systems, the values, the religion, the technology, basically the markers of the White West. So modernization, which they called Gaiwa or enlightenment, it got completely fused with this idea of racial destiny. The projecta became climbing out of what they saw as semi-barbarism, a status imposed by colonialism, and achieving full civilization by adopting these Western symbols.
Almost like proving Korea was worthy of playing by Western rules.
Precisely. Proving they could manage the systems associated with the top races.
And this wasn't just theoretical for Rhee. The sources highlight some really stark examples of him making this explicit, acts of what's called symbolic purification. There's that shocking quote about warning Koreans.
That's right. It's quite brutal. When he was rallying support, he explicitly warned Koreans not to follow the footsteps of the African blacks if they wanted to become a robust race of a prosperous nation. You really have to pause and think about the calculation behind that statement.
It's incredibly jarring. Why that specific comparison? What was the strategic or psychological purpose there within this framework?
It seems to have been a very deliberate symbolic act aimed at positioning Korea within that existing racial hierarchy. By pointing to African Americans, a group facing severe marginalization even within the West that Rhee admired, he was performing what the sources call an exercising the stigma of inferiority.
So by contrasting Koreans against Black people, he was trying to claim a higher rung for Koreans.
Essentially, yes. It was a way of displacing the stigma of being colonized onto another group, perceived as lower on the global racial ladder. He was implicitly saying to the West, look, we're not that kind of subordinate people. We have the capacity for your kind of civilization.
And this thinking wasn't entirely new when Rhee formalized it.
No, the sources show the roots go deeper. Even back in the late 19th century, Korean newspapers like Dokkanipsinman were already publishing articles that classified the world into different races and ranked them by levels of enlightenment.
So social Darwinism was already taking hold.
It seems so. The idea that your race determined your national destiny, a core tenet of Western eugenics, had already begun to be internalized. So Rhee's later state ideology, well, maybe more extreme, was building on fertile ground.
Okay, so Rhee returns, armed with this conviction that national greatness requires not just political freedom, but a kind of biological and moral purity defined against a Western benchmark, which leads us directly into how he built the state itself around this idea. So Rhee becomes the first president of the Republic of Korea. And his guiding philosophy wasn't just politics, was it? It was this concept called ilminji, the one people principle. What did that entail?
Right, ilminji was potent stuff. It basically fused two powerful currents. On one hand, you had fervent American-style anti-communism, which was crucial for getting U.S. support, obviously.
Essential for survival then.
Absolutely. But it combined that with this incredibly exclusive, inward-looking nationalism. One source even calls it quasi-fascist. The core demand was total conformity. The mantra was literally one bloodline, one fate, one ideology. And the critical thing here is how Rhee elevated Sunheil, the idea of shared ethnicity or pure blood, from just a cultural notion into something almost biological, almost religious. It became the mandatory basis of the state.
So it mirrored Western eugenics thinking, the idea that the nation's health depends on its racial purity.
Exactly. The state's role, in this view, included policing the national bloodstream, ensuring its purity.
And if you're policing purity, you inevitably create categories of impurity. Who became the main targets of this state-sanctioned purification?
Overwhelmingly, the targets were mixed-race children. They were called Hunho, meaning mixed blood. Specifically, this often meant Amerasians children born to Korean women and American soldiers, particularly during and after the Korean War.
Why are they seen as such a profound threat?
Because they embodied the core contradiction in Rhee's whole project. Think about it. Korea was deeply entangled with the West. The U.S. provided aid, military protection, the model for modernization Rhee admired.
Right.
Yet these children, the direct result of that entanglement, they fundamentally threatened the illusion of ethnic purity that Rhee's nationalism depended on. They were living proof that the Korean bloodline wasn't monolithic, that the nation's reality was already mixed.
The government's response documented in the sources is, frankly, horrifying. It wasn't just neglect, was it? It was policy.
It was chillingly deliberate. One of the most devastating findings in the sources is the statement that Rhee's government viewed these children as, and this is a direct quote, garbage that the country needed to get rid of.
Garbage.
It's hard to even process. But it wasn't just rhetoric. It translated into policy. These children were often denied citizenship, denied basic social support. They were effectively rendered stateless, non-persons within their own birthplace.
So how did the state actually implement this getting rid of? How do you manage what you see as a domestic problem that undermined your core ideology?
They built an institution for it. In 1954, the government set up the Child Placement Service. Now, on the surface, it might have had a veneer of humanitarianism, finding homes for orphans.
But the reality was different.
The reality, according to the sources, was that this service became the primary infrastructure for large-scale overseas adoptions. It was essentially a mechanism for exporting the children deemed impure, sending them away, often back to the West, the very source of the mixing.
So international adoption as a tool for ethnic cleansing.
That's how the sources frame it, yeah. A literal cleansing of the national bloodstream. This operation eventually led to hundreds of thousands of Korean children being adopted internationally over the following decades. South Korea became, for a time, the world's largest sender of children for adoption. Internally, this wasn't necessarily seen as a tragedy, but as a necessary step to preserve national vitality by removing perceived biological contaminants. It's a textbook case of a state applying principles borrowed from Western eugenics for its own national project.
Hidden behind a mask of charity.
Precisely. A mass purification project disguised as humanitarianism.
The scale of that, the institutionalization, it really underscores that this wasn't some marginal belief. It was baked into the nation-building process itself.
Okay, so Syngman Rhee lays down this ideological bedrock of purity. Then Park Chung-hee takes power in '61 through a coup. Did he discard this purity myth, or did he adapt it?
He absolutely adapted it. Park inherited that core commitment to Sunheil, to homogeneity, but he gave it a new spin. Rhee's approach had this sort of quasi-religious, moralistic tone. Park's was much more pragmatic, much more focused on rapid economic development.
The famous miracle on the Han River.
Exactly. Park framed his push for the modernization of the fatherland not just as an economic goal, making the country richer. He framed it as an issue of racial survival. His argument was basically, only through intense industrial growth and national wealth could Korea avoid falling back into colonial subjugation or being swallowed by communism. Economic success became the proof of racial vitality. Failure would mean the Korean race itself was somehow deficient.
So the pressure to perform economically was also pressure to perform racially. Yes. If Korea was pure, disciplined, and unified under his leadership, they would succeed economically. The success would validate the race.
This sounds like what the sources call the shift towards a technocratic myth of purity. How did that play out?
Well, the myth became that Korea's incredible economic boom, the speed of it was unprecedented, was the direct outcome of having this single, unified, highly disciplined ethnic group pulling together. The efficiency of the big conglomerates, the cables, was presented almost as evidence of the inherent strength and moral superiority derived from this pure bloodline.
So conformity wasn't just political anymore. It was economic and racial all rolled into one.
Absolutely. Economic performance became the performance of racial conformity. And this wasn't just for domestic consumption. Park's regime was acutely aware of the need to prove itself to the West, to the U.S., to international markets, to former colonizers like Japan.
They needed to show a non-white nation could match Western productivity.
Right. And the implicit argument was that they could do it provided they maintained this strict internal discipline, this moral and racial purity at home. So the entire economic machine became a vehicle for demonstrating racial worthiness on a global stage.
This pressure to conform, to appear civilized and disciplined to the West. Did it extend beyond factories and government policies into personal life? Into, say, aesthetics?
Oh, absolutely. The sources draw a very direct line from this long history of internalizing Western racial ideals starting way back, but really solidified under Rhee and Park, to contemporary Korean beauty standards.
You mean things like K-beauty?
Yes, indirectly. The deep-seated aspiration for progress and civilization, which got equated with whiteness, translated into ideals about how people should look. Think about the emphasis on skin whitening, for example. Paleness became associated not just with class, not working outdoors, but with civility, modernity, distance from primitive darkness.
And plastic surgery, things like the double eyelid surgery.
That's another key example the sources raise. Procedures aimed at creating features perceived as more Western, or less distinctly Asian, became incredibly popular. It wasn't just about vanity. It was about embodying the civilized ideal. The look itself became a performance of having achieved modernity, of having ascended that racial ladder.
So ironically, the global phenomenon of K-beauty today might have some roots in this deep internalized desire to meet aesthetic standards originally set by the West.
That's the argument, yes. It's a complex legacy. South Korea achieved phenomenal material success, becoming a trendsetter. But some of those trends, that success, were built on a foundation that remained tied to the very racial comparisons that initially marked Koreans as inferior.
They used the master's tools, perhaps even mastered them, but didn't fully dismantle the master's house.
Something like that. The poor blood myth fueled the discipline needed for development, but it came at a significant cost to a more authentic or internally generated sense of self, perhaps.
Which brings us to the present day, the legacy. Rhee and Park are long gone. South Korea is a global power. But this ideology, this belief in Sunheil as a national cornerstone, it doesn't just vanish, does it? The sources say it still echoes today.
It absolutely echoes, and the costs are becoming increasingly apparent. We're moving beyond just historical analysis here into the ongoing moral and social fabric of the country. Some sources talk about a resulting spiritual disfigurement, a kind of suppression of the human soul.
Spiritual disfigurement. What does that mean in this context?
It means that when a society defines human worth so narrowly based on race, based on conformity to a borrowed ideal of civilization or whiteness, it forces people into a kind of pseudo-humanism. You might achieve political freedom, economic success, but if your internal compass for judging yourself and others is still based on these external racialized categories, if you have to suppress empathy or conscience to maintain this fiction of purity, then you end up with a kind of hollow identity, materially free perhaps, but spiritually still bound by that old racial logic.
And we can see tangible evidence of this disfigurement in ongoing social hierarchies, right? It's not just abstract.
Definitely not. Look at the persistence of colorism. Paler skin still often translates to better social and economic opportunities. It's a visible marker tied to those old ideas of civility and purity.
And how does this play out with immigration? South Korea is much more diverse now than it was.
Well, that's where you see the hierarchical multicultural order very clearly. The purity myth creates distinct tiers. Western immigrants, especially white professionals or English teachers, often occupy a privileged space. They're sometimes treated as prestige foreigners, implicitly valued because they represent the original benchmark of whiteness.
Whereas other groups?
Immigrants from less prestigious backgrounds, like Southeast Asian laborers or women who marry Korean men from rural areas, often face significant discrimination. They encounter bureaucratic hurdles, social prejudice, sometimes outright hostility. The old racial ladder Rhee was trying to climb, it's still implicitly there, ranking newcomers based on their perceived proximity to that original white ideal.
And what about the Hanyul, the mixed-race individuals who were the original targets? Has life improved for them?
It's complicated. There's more awareness, certainly, and more multicultural families, but the deep-seated national anxiety over mixed-race identity persists. Children from these families still report facing bullying, discrimination in schools, and a feeling of not truly belonging because their very existence challenges that core myth of ethnic homogeneity. It's deeply ironic, isn't it? The state now promotes multiculturalism out of demographic necessity. They need immigrants, they need births. But the underlying social structure, the one built on purity, hasn't fundamentally changed its capacity to accept difference as truly equal.
This leads us to what might be the most dramatic, maybe even self-destructive consequence of this whole ideology, the demographic crisis. South Korea's birth rate is famously the lowest in the world. The sources directly link this back to the obsession with Sun Hyol. How does that connection work?
It's the ultimate tragic irony. This intense focus on preserving a pure bloodline, which stemmed from eugenic anxieties about national vitality, has paradoxically led to a situation where the society is struggling to reproduce itself at all. The sources don't just put it down to economics, like the high cost of education, although that's a factor. They identify a deeper issue, an identity crisis manifesting as social infertility.
Social infertility, what does that mean?
It refers to the structural condition where society becomes so rigid, so fixated on conformity and maintaining an impossible ideal of purity that its own members essentially refuse to reproduce within it. Think about the immense pressure in South Korea to marry the right kind of person, from the right background to maintain the family's social standing, which is implicitly tied to this purity ideal. Think about the anxiety of raising a child who might not succeed in the hyper-competitive meritocracy, or who might be judged for not fitting the narrow aesthetic or social mold.
So the perceived costs, social, psychological, not just financial, of bringing a child into this highly pressurized conformist system becomes too high for many people.
Exactly. The pressure to maintain the illusion of purity and success is so intense that many individuals, especially women, are opting out of marriage and childbirth altogether. The desire to protect the homogeneous ideal ultimately results in the shrinking of the population it was meant to preserve.
It's like the system is consuming itself.
That's a good way to put it. The pure blood myth, intended as the engine of national strength, has become, as one source vividly puts it, a demographic noose tightening around the nation's neck. The very foundation rebuilt is now arguably collapsing under demographic pressure. The state enforced purity so relentlessly that it bred its own decline.
So, to bring this all together for you, our listener, this deep dive reveals something crucial. South Korea's incredible modern journey is real, its success undeniable. But its identity isn't a simple story of indigenous triumph. It's a complex reflection, a mirror showing the imprint of 20th century Western moral and racial ideas that were maintained for decades through state power and social exclusion. And the tragedy highlighted here is that while the nation achieved independence and remarkable prosperity, it did so in part by remaining bound to the very racial hierarchies it initially sought to overcome. That drive to be seen as robust and prosperous ended up rooting Koreans' self-worth in comparison, and often in the exclusion of others deemed lesser.
Yeah, and that means the challenge South Korea faces now isn't just about fixing the economy or boosting the birth rate, though those are urgent. It's fundamentally a spiritual or moral challenge. The path forward, as suggested by this analysis, involves consciously reclaiming a sense of humanity from the grip of this ideology, this ghost of Western eugenics that wore the mask of Korean patriotism for so long. It requires acknowledging that the modern Korean self was always, in reality, a hybrid forged from colonial pain, yes, but also from borrowed Western ambition and immense disciplined effort. To really thrive now, the nation arguably needs to dismantle that old cornerstone of homogeneity and fully embrace the multicultural, multiracial reality it already lives in.
This detailed history leaves us and you with a final provocative question, and it's a question that resonates far beyond Korea, touching many nations shaped by colonialism and Western influence.
Can a society that was built consciously or unconsciously on a myth of purity, especially a borrowed racial ideology, truly sustain itself, morally and demographically, in a world that is, in reality, increasingly and irrevocably mixed?
In the end, every story is more than history. It's energy, vibration, and memory. What we remember determines who we become. This is Culture and History, his story. Join me next time as we trace the journey of culture and history of humanity. Until then, reflect on your story, because humanity's culture depends on it.